Welcome back. Recessions and depressions cause hardship and failure, of course, but they can also lead to productivity gains and brand new innovation. So what changes could emerge from the recent financial crisis? Well, that's the subject of a new book from business prof Richard Florida. It's called The Great Reset: How New Ways of Living and Working Drive Post-Crash Prosperity. Great to have you here.
It's great to be here, Amanda.
Let's first take a look at the premise here that these periods of dislocation and disruption actually create innovation. What did you find when you looked into that?
Well, I went back and looked at the previous events that look like the current crisis and recovery that we're now in, the Great Depression of the 1930s, and then there was another event in the late 19th century. The most important thing I think I could say is that these are long-term processes, and I listed into your previous guest. You don't get out of things with a giant V like this, like a V-shaped recovery. In fact, in the past two, and Canada's in much better shape here than the United States, as we know, they were generational events until we reestablished the conditions for real prosperity. So I think it may go up, it may go down. The housing market may bounce around. Consumer confidence is up, spending is up one day. But I think in the long run, we're looking at a much longer process than most people think until we enter a new round of innovation, prosperity, and growth.
And how does that normally happen? Do we know why it happens? Is it just that it was so disruptive an event like the Great Depression that it sort of turns a page for people and they're more creative? Why does
well,
this
I think
happen?
the economy becomes very productive, whether that was in the 1920s or the 1890s or now. Now we have idea-driven, technology-based industries. And without a new set of industries to flow into, it flows into a bubble. And then what has to happen, and I talked about this in the book, what really drove growth after the Depression wasn't just government spending, New Deal spending and Keynesianism, wasn't even World War II mobilization. It was the rise of a new way of life, suburbanization and keeping up with the Joneses, which created demand for those industrial assembly line products. I think we're at the cusp of defining this new way of life now, but I'll tell you, it's no longer going to be around lots of spending on housing and energy and transport. We're going to have to make those things more efficient and in a way more affordable to open up new avenues for spending on technology, biotech, healthcare, education, development, and experience.
It's interesting because at the end of the Great Depression, we had the New Deal, and if you go back to that period, the CEO of a company made roughly what a high school principal made. There wasn't this great gulf between the very highest paid and the rest of us. We now have these great gulfs, these inequities. Do you foresee some kind of situation where that gets driven out of the system somehow?
I hope so. I mean, we have the greatest level of economic inequality in our society since the 1920s. And I think in many respects, it's not the Depression that we should look at. It's this crisis of the 1870s when the new industries, the heavy industries were emerging and inequality was much worse. Then as now, or now as then, we are developing whole new industries, and the level of inequality, and what's worse today, and the book points this out, it's not just a class inequality or a CEO to principal inequality. It's really reflected in our geography. We have a geography of inequality, certain regions doing much better than others and certain parts of cities doing much better than others. The book says we're going to have to build a more equitable and a more efficient society and actually create a whole new source of jobs to grow again.
I want to drill down to this. You mentioned homeownership. One of the premises that you're advancing here is that we got to move away from the idea that owning a house is the be-all and end-all, that it robs us of flexibility and ties us into this kind of thing we may not be able to afford. Walk me through that, because for most of us, by the time we get to retirement, it's the one saving we accidentally made. It's the one nest egg we still have, right? Because we're really bad savers.
I mean, for your viewers, it's a non-diverse, illiquid investment. It's like the thing your financial advisor would say, stay away from. I actually looked at the data in great detail, and this is amazing. Cities and regions with the highest levels of home ownership have lower rates of innovation, lower rates of income, lower rates of wages, lower rates of happiness. So what we're finding, actually, Canada has now a 70% rate of home ownership, higher than the States by a couple percentage. Actually, the States is dropping down.
Right.
When you get to a city or region about 55% or 60% home ownership, that's almost perfect. And why? Not only is that city faster and flexible, but when hard times hit and you're not an owner, you're a renter, you can more easily take a new job, relocate to a new region, or just downshift to a more affordable place. So I think one of the things we have to think about, every great reset comes with a new form of housing. The home ownership model, the great Canadian dream, was perfect for the post-war era. I think we have to pull back on it just a bit now and encourage a little bit more renting.
So it's not that we're not saving, but it gives us the flexibility to be, because one of the things you've been a proponent of for years now is the mobility of the labor force. We need to go where the jobs are rather than expecting the jobs to come to us.
Well, I think the great success story of North America, Canada and the U.S., is that we're these super mobile countries. And people, well, I guess we're immigrant nations, right? People like my grandparents came here from, and new Canadians come here from foreign countries. So we're able to adjust much better than the more sclerotic, slower moving European and Asian economies. I think, though, a little bit in some of the older regions, and then when the bubbles burst and you're underwater in that house, you can't move. I think Canada, of course, we didn't have nearly as bad of a bubble as the U.S., so we've been a little bit more mobile. But I think we have to think about new and better forms of housing people, including better, not just the typical rental, better rentals, higher end rentals that encourage the flexibility we need for an innovative, high productivity, highly creative economy.
So there's some policy around this stuff, right? Obviously there's got to be kind of a framework. Somebody's got to build those units. Is it government policy? How does this all happen?
I think we have to encourage, we did after the war encourage this new system of home ownership. We encouraged mortgage lending. We created the secondary mortgage market institutions in the U.S. They created tax incentives to undergird it, and we subsidized it. So, but a private market emerged. I think, first of all, we pull the subsidies out. I think that's just a no-brainer. We can't subsidize this thing anymore. And secondly, we try to do everything we can to make the rental sector more efficient. What I'm imagining, especially in those towns and communities that have so many empty condo complexes, the towns that are so hit with foreclosure and abandoned housing, let's start to roll them up, and let's create larger enterprise or encourage larger enterprise to roll those up and make rental housing available not only across cities but across regions, across Canada, and across the United States, across North America.
Interesting. So, and could you have a timeline on how long you think all this sort of evolution might take?
Well, I'll tell you what worries me here, living in Canada, living in Toronto. I see, now the U.S. is currently going through a mess on Capitol Hill. But actually, there is a big discussion now about how to remake the mortgage system, how to recast housing, how to encourage more renting. I think we may be a little bit complacent because our banks are stable, our housing market is running on full gas again. I think we've got to be smart and we've got to think this through. We need a little urgency back here at home.
Richard, great to have you here.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
Richard Florida, the book is called The Great Reset, How New Ways of Living and Working Drive Post-Crash Prosperity.